My own personal view is that it was a lovely sensational story and it sells papers. And a lot of people may have probably thought there was something in it at the time.
Another theory held that Jack the Ripper was an American, a doctor named Francis Tumblety. A frequent visitor to London with dubious medical credentials, Tumblety had over the years faced a number of charges, including malpractice, sedition, and possibly a part in the Lincoln assassination. Just 2 days before Mary Kelly's murder, Tumblety was arrested for assault, then later released. His whereabouts were unknown until the end of November, when he departed for New York City.
He was actually followed to New York by Inspector Andrews, one of the investigators, from where Tumblety fled.
Police on both sides of the Atlantic waited for Tumblety to appear. Railway stations and departing steamers were closely watched. But he was never seen again, leading some to think he was the Ripper.
I think there are lots of reasons that make him a good suspect. I think it was given some credence when Wynne Baxter, the coroner, summed up at the inquest on Chapman and said that an American doctor had been trying to buy wombs from one of the London teaching hospitals. He also was allegedly the possessor of a collection of wombs in glass jars back in 1865 around Washington, when he was practising in Washington. So it's a combination of things, really. He was arrested at the time of the murders. There is just nothing that can conclusively say he couldn't be the Ripper.
But skeptics point to several reasons why Tumblety probably isn't the Ripper. To begin with, he was older and considerably taller than the suspects described by witnesses. Plus, he wore a moustache with very long, waxed ends. He was also a known homosexual, placing him at odds with the behaviour of serial killers who usually victimize the gender that attracts them. Lastly, Tumblety would have been a stranger in the community.
Just patterns of speech alone would have given him away. So he would have been more suspect. He would have stood out. But again, for the women, the economic potential of such a man might have led them to see him differently and to engage in contact.
By 1894, 6 years after the murders, speculation about the Ripper's identity was still rampant. That year, Chief Constable Sir Melville Macnaghten wrote a memorandum refuting a newspaper article alleging that the Ripper was a man named Thomas Cutbush.
He claimed Thomas Cutbush had been interviewed by police officers and totally exonerated, and he couldn't possibly have done the murders. As he went on, he said, not only was Cutbush nothing to do with this at all, he said, I can name 3 top suspects that the police officers at the time, 6 years previously, considered far more likely to have been Jack the Ripper.
He named Montague M.J. Druitt, who he called a doctor, but who in fact was a barrister and teacher. He named Kosminski, without a first name, just Kosminski, a Polish Jew. And he also named Michael Ostrog, who in fact was a con man and a convict, and who the police later had in custody, so it's virtually impossible that he was the Ripper.
According to Macnaghten, the most likely of the 3 suspects was Montague Druitt, who disappeared shortly after Mary Kelly's murder. But strangely, Macnaghten's memorandum was the only document ever to name Druitt.
We have absolutely no idea why he was ever suspected of being the Ripper. He committed suicide at the end of December 1888. He drowned himself in the Thames, apparently because of some misdemeanour at the boys' school that he was teaching at.
Macnaghten based much of his belief on secret documents that he allegedly destroyed prior to his retirement.
All we know is that Sir Melville Macnaghten says that at some point later after the crimes, that he received private information that suggested that Druitt was the murderer, and he was quite prepared to believe that.
Another of Macnaghten's suspects also seems highly unlikely.
His name was Michael Ostrog. Nothing was known about him until quite recently. We've now discovered quite a lot about him. He was a petty sneak thief. Again, there's no obvious reason why anybody would ever have suspected that he was Jack the Ripper.
The remaining suspect was a man named Kosminski, a Polish Jew who, according to Macnaghten, possessed a great hatred of women, particularly prostitutes, and had strong homicidal tendencies. There were many reasons that made Kosminski a prime suspect, but one seemed particularly telling. Dr. Robert Anderson, Deputy Commissioner under Sir Charles Warren, published an autobiography some 20 years after the murders. He called it The Lighter Side of My Official Life. Detective Donald Swanson, who worked under Anderson, had read the book, scribbling notes along the margins. In 1987, a descendant of Swanson had those notes printed in the Daily Telegraph. What they revealed was startling. That Swanson and Anderson knew exactly who Jack the Ripper was.
Swanson, in some notes that he made in his own personal copy of Sir Robert Anderson's autobiography, identified that individual as somebody called Kosminski.
He wrote in the margin of that book, yes, we did know who Jack the Ripper was at the time, and he said it was Kosminski. And he actually said Kosminski.